Cool. Well, my name is Max Wilbert. I know some of you already, but some of you I don't know. So just to give you a little background on who I am and where I'm coming from, I grew up in Seattle, and I came of age politically in the post-WTO era. This anti-globalization energy was perfusing Seattle. So I kind of grew up in this mixture of influences politically. There were anarchists, there were Marxists, there were people who were indigenous following the Zapatista struggles. There were people involved in labor unions and that sort of struggle. And I am the third generation that I know of political dissidents in my family. So my grandfather was a conscientious objector. Both my parents were heavily involved in fighting the Vietnam War and fighting apartheid, among other things. And then comes me. So I grew up in Seattle, and I came to this analysis in part because I spent a lot of time as a kid visiting the Olympic Peninsula. Every summer since I was born, I've been going out to the Ozette Triangle and camping on the beach. Haven't missed a summer yet in 31 years. And so I always grew up contrasting where I grew up in this heavily urban, very poor environment in South Seattle, where the contrast between wealth and business and poverty and homelessness and concrete and pollution was so stark. And then contrasting that with the Olympic coast, and contrasting that with biodiversity and life. And of course, we all know that even a place like Olympic National Park is heavily degraded. It's degraded compared to what it was historically. So I want to acknowledge, first of all, that I believe we're on Clallam land. Is that right? Mm-hmm. Right now?
Well,
and Clallam land?
I don't know.
The Clallam people.
Okay.
And I think it's really important that we frame that. I don't just want to acknowledge that and sort of move on, but I want to use that as a framing throughout this whole talk, because for the Clallam people, like so many indigenous people, the experience of colonization has been an ongoing war. It has been an invasion and a war against their people that has gone on in this place for going on 200 years at this point. So this is going to be a bit of a challenging topic. It's hard for me to talk about this. It's hard to communicate what I'm trying to say in the right way and not come across wrong. And so I just want to acknowledge that this may be uncomfortable at times, and there's been a lot of feel-good energy at this conference. And I appreciate that, but I don't know about the rest of you, but that gets frustrating for me sometimes. At that grief panel yesterday, one of the things that was brought up was anger. And I feel a lot of anger. And I feel like in the environmental movement, in our movements in general, we're encouraged to quash that anger, to repress that anger. We're taught to value judge that anger and say that it's bad because it can be destructive. And there's good reasons for that, because, our movement, we try and challenge things like patriarchy, we try and challenge abuse, we try and challenge a lot of these things that come out of anger and that come out of this, this overactive sense of anger that's out of control. But I think that anger can be a very constructive, positive emotion if it's coming out for the right reason, if you're in control of it, if you're in balance with it, rather than it being something that controls you. So we're going to be diving into anger a little bit, and I'm going to be expressing some of my anger. Mm-hmm. So why revolutionary ecology? We're going to talk about what this means, and I just want to be specific up front. I'm not talking about a revolution in ideas or in the mind. I'm actually talking about revolution in the real world, as in the overturning or the destruction of unjust systems and their replacement with something else. So we're gonna go through what this could look like. So why is this a necessary topic right now? We all know what's happening, but I think so often we don't grapple with it. We don't confront it face to face, even in spaces like this. That's one reason why I really appreciate people like Dar's work, because he does that. He brings it to people's, with your climate dispatches, you bring it right in front of people's face, and you say, this is what's happening. Let's not ignore it. Let's not gloss over it. Let's not try and work around it. Let's face it. Let's face what's actually happening. So, there are 70 million tons of greenhouse gases being emitted per day by this culture. And that number is actually probably something like 10 years old at this point. So it's probably more like, 75, something like that, I would guess. We're currently at 414.52 parts per million. That's a measurement from Mauna Loa in Hawaii on Tuesday. 414 parts per million. We are in the midst of the 6th mass extinction event. This is not something that's new. It's not something that's primarily driven by climate change up to this point. In fact, only a very, very tiny minority of species that have gone extinct and are going extinct right now are because of climate change. It's mostly because of habitat destruction, the introduction of non-native species, and other factors. So we need to understand that there are a bunch of different issues here. We know that as climate continues to destabilize, we're going to see increasing war, increasing refugee crisis, increasing food insecurity, drought, water shortages, all these things, right? And I hope we also know that all of these issues are really inextricably connected. We can't break them apart. We know that the biggest predictor of biodiversity is whether or not indigenous people are living on their land. That is the best single predictor of biodiversity and intact habitat in a place. We know what the legacy is of Walmart and consumer culture, the plastics in the oceans, the giant landfills all over the world. And we know that's linked to sweatshop labor. We know that's linked to the exploitation of poor people in Bangladesh and Haiti and Sri Lanka and the maquiladoras in Mexico. We know that the ruling class prioritizes the extraction of wealth. So all of these issues are connected, whether they are stealing land from indigenous people, like happened right here on this land where we're standing, former military base, or whether the ruling class is exploiting poor people for their labor, or blowing up mountains, drilling for oil, railroading black and brown people into prison, for-profit prisons. We know that all of these things are tied together because they're about the extraction of resources. They're about the extraction of wealth and power and resources from the natural world, from human communities, and stealing those things. So systems of oppression are not a mistake. And I think that that is a misconception that gets thrown around a lot in liberal communities. Systems of oppression are not happening simply because people have a misunderstanding or a mistake, or it's sort of an accident that we can just educate people and they'll realize, oh, race isn't real. We don't need to have racism, and it will magically disappear. These are concrete systems of power that exist to provide material benefit to certain classes over others, right? Capitalism is not a mistake or a misunderstanding. Patriarchy is not a mistake or a misunderstanding. Racism is not a mistake or a misunderstanding. These are deliberately set up and they're deliberately maintained. That's not to say that every single person who's maintaining those systems knows what they're doing and is, has some diabolical plan. But in general, these are deliberate systems that were set up and are maintained for certain reasons. So when I talk about revolutionary ecology in this workshop, I want to be clear that even though we have the word ecology in here, I'm talking about this as a foundation, because ecology is the foundation of life, natural communities of non-humans and humans, the foundation of all life. But we're not just talking about the environmental movement, this sort of silo or bubble. This is everything. All of these issues are linked together. So this conference is mostly focused on earth repair, right? There have been a lot of talks about permaculture, land restoration, carbon sequestration, eco-villages, a lot of alternative ways of surviving for human communities and of healing the land. And I want us to recognize that while we're here doing this, and this is critical work. It's very important work, and I don't want anybody to ever think that I'm trying to denigrate it. But while this is happening, we need to recognize what's happening in the rest of the world. In that, a few miles down from here is the Bangor submarine base, where a third of the U.S. nuclear arsenal is located. The U.S. military is still going about its business all around the world right now, while we're here having talks about eco-villages. They're doing drone bombings all over the world. They're conducting special operations. The World Trade Organization, the World Bank, the IMF, they're doing what they do right now. They're wielding the weapons of financial imperialism to destroy and exploit poor countries and third world countries to make the rich richer.
And politics of distraction so that we pay attention to the wrong things.
Right. So I want us to recognize that what we're doing here is really important, and it's very important that we address systems of oppression inside ourselves, inside our communities. That's all critical. But I also want us to recognize that we are primarily not the problem. The people who are here are not the problem. And, so we can change our behavior, but this will have little impact on the ruling class and on what's happening at a global scale. So, as I said, most of what's happening here this weekend is earth repair. And I think of this largely as a form of defensive struggle. I think of it as defensive struggle. And we can say the same thing about most of the activism and the organizing that we see in this country. So for example, Standing Rock, a big example that people are recognizing. Standing Rock was fighting one pipeline, the expansion of a pipeline, the building of a new pipeline. It wasn't fighting established pipelines. It wasn't fighting established fossil fuel industry. It was fighting the expansion of industry. So even if that campaign was a total success, it would only have stopped expansion. It would not have rolled back what's already happening, which in itself is big enough to destroy the entire world, as we have seen. So I want us to recognize that so many of our fights, the fight against Line 3, the fight against mountaintop removal, the fight against Keystone XL, they're defensive fights. So when I say defensive, I don't necessarily mean that as a bad thing, because I think it's very honorable for one to draw your line in the sand and say we're not gonna let this happen. And it's very important that we do that because it keeps doors open. Like I said, I grew up going every year to the forest out here on the peninsula, and I think about those Sitka spruce trees as I walk that final quarter mile down to the beach, those old growth Sitka spruce on that hillside. And if somebody was coming to cut those trees down, I would do whatever it took to stop them. Mm-hmm. Right? So we need to do this. It's honorable. So I want to do a quick exercise, and I was going to have us split in small groups, but I think we should just stay together maybe as a big group. And I want to give you a few minutes, and maybe you could just think, you could talk amongst yourselves, and I want you to think about what sort of list can we come up with of victories, holding actions, and defeats in the environmental movement, but just to frame it in that way. As we've seen, these issues are all linked, but just to frame it in that way. So victories, holding actions, and then defeats. And as far as victories, in all of these, I don't really want us to use policies. So for example, I wouldn't consider passing the Endangered Species Act a victory. I would consider the effects of that a victory. So if, using the Endangered Species Act to bring back the bald eagle from the verge of extinction, I would actually consider that a victory because that's something happening in the real world. It's not just something happening at the human bureaucracy level. And similarly with defeat, so I wouldn't, a victory would be something like the removal of the dams from the Elwha River, right? I wouldn't consider it to be, I would. That's a good example of a real tangible victory. And then holding actions, I don't want us to consider like a temporary victory as a victory. So for example, the Keystone XL, that's been held up as a big victory. But as we know, a lot of the oil that was going to be flowing through the Keystone XL, they just rerouted it through oil trains, right? And so that was a holding action. It wasn't a real victory. And so a defeat is more clear, like, drilling for oil in Anwar. That's a real tangible defeat in the real world.
Can I say something?
Yeah.
Our very language is polluted by using the word Anwar instead of saying Arctic refuge.
Thank you.
And it's something we so easily fall into because we hear it everywhere.
What's the concern with using an acronym?
Anwar is a term that doesn't mean anything to you emotionally. It is simply an acronym, and it sounds like war, Anwar. It is the acronym that's used by the oil industry. For Arctic refuge means something to us, because that's what it's supposed to be, a refuge.
Okay,
it's actually the Arctic National Wilderness Wildlife Refuge, but
So do people want to start throwing out some victories, and I'll write them up here? Elwa, give that one to you.
It's very small, but bring the wolves back into Yellowstone?
Yep.
Yeah.
The ozone.
Yes.
Yeah, that's a big one.
Yeah, acid rain.
Okay.
There's one pipeline in BC that was completely helped, Northern Gateway.
Yeah.
This Northern Gateway pipeline.
Okay.
Cherry Point Coal Terminal.
How about coal ports on the west coast of the U.S.?
That's sort of a general category.
They just went through Canada.
A more specific example is that in my lifetime,
But
air
actually,
quality in Los Angeles has improved enormously.
actually, the coal ports are holding action that if they can go through Canada, so maybe it's on the border.
Yeah, or if the federal government overrules it.
Well, I just want to say also the increase in no-till farming in the Midwest. That's really catching on.
It's not necessarily a win, but it increases chemical use.
It is spread.
Holding action.
Standing Rock.
Standing Rock was a defeat.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was
I mean, it was a victory
Yes.
in other senses.
Pebble Mine has been a holding action, but it's looking more and more like a defeat.
So most obvious big one in BC is First Nations legal action against Trans Mountain Pipeline. They temporarily halted it.
Yeah,
It's
that is a holding
currently,
action.
it's currently halted?
Yes.
Okay.
Trans Mountain.
Okay. Any more holding actions?
Boundary waters.
Boundary waters, the copper mine or whatever.
I mean, at this point, I consider the Clean Water Act a holding action instead of a victory.
Yep.
It's getting stripped away as we speak.
Yep.
Same thing with the Clean Air Act.
Yeah, and the national parks and all that things.
Okay. Few more victories that I could put on the list would be the White Salmon Dam removal. California condor, I think, is sort of
Yeah.
getting there.
You did some more opinion for us, right? Or something?
Yeah.
Holding action or victory?
Holding action, for sure.
People heard of the
Immediate defeat.
Yeah.
Stan? That's huge in BC.
Yeah, that's
Unistote, now we holding action.
Not
They're,
too
they're
fast.
for-
It's a
forcing
victory.
through that pipeline now, but
How about every
Enforcement.
endangered species that's
It's not
ever gone
quite-
extinct
it's
in the
not-
defeat category?
well,
Forestry.
they've broken
Yeah.
through the Clean Air.
Well,
Just
there's some
lost
activity
species.
there, but they're still holding.
Okay.
A
How
small
about
group-
defeat?
Yeah.
Sorry.
I was going to say a small group of people in Montana held back drilling. It was like the Montana front.
The Rocky Mountain Front Consortium.
Yes, right.
But they're a victory because
They're a victory,
they're
yeah.
a victory as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, they kept drilling from coming there. And there was
Or
a-
oil?
Rocky Mountain Front,
Yeah.
they actually got oil companies, and they shamed them into releasing their leases back in, and they created a wilderness area and protected area all at once. And it involved a consortium of ranchers and citizens and NGOs and so forth. The rollback of the offshore drilling regulations. After the British Petroleum, the Obama administration made some very stringent offshore drilling requirements. Trump just rolled them back a couple days ago.
Right. So we could
would
just
that
again
be the same
to keep it in the real world and not the policy level. We could just say the offshore drilling itself. Right?
Exactly.
Tongass National Forest?
Tongass logging. In fact, we could extend that because we know that 98% of the old growth in this country has been logged, right?
Loss of glaciers.
Yeah, lots of prairie then, only 95% prairie, right?
fracking well? Occupy Wall Street as a movement, yes.
My handwriting's getting worse and worse up here. Okay, more defeats.
Site C.
Site C dam.
That's still holding, I think. I think that collapsed. Put a little dot.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure they're just building it at this point.
Yeah, they're building it now, but yeah, they're definitely building it.
This is the garbage patch?
You could just say plastic pollution is down.
Yeah, it's
414.52 parts per million.
10-to-1 ratio of plastic to plankton in the oceans at this point.
All the mountains that are gone.
Yeah, mountaintop removal.
How about
The earth.
No thawing tundra.
I mean, this list could just go on.
Yeah,
and on,
it goes on.
right? We've got.
Dot, dot, dot.
So what I've got written down is BP Deepwater Horizon,
Yeah.
tar sands,
Mm-hmm.
the uranium contamination of Iraq and Afghanistan, which is going to be there for the next, 100,000 years or something along those lines. Oceanic dead zones, topsoil loss,
Drought.
the boom in coal exports and the boom in coal power plant construction worldwide is booming right now.
Citizens United.
There's a worldwide boom in dam construction that's happening right now. Hundreds of large dams being constructed all around the world. And then, of course, there's this itself. We like to pretend that 350 parts per million is a safe number, when the reality is that the small island nations were arguing for years that the level needed to be 275 parts per million, I believe. And in fact, the big nonprofits like 350.org and Tick Tick Tick, their Tick 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 campaign, actually undermined the small island states at the climate negotiations, because when the small island states went up there and said, we need 275 parts per million, these NGOs then started coming around and campaigning for 350 parts per million. So they undercut the message of the people who are the first mass victims of climate change. So,
Now, so what was before the Industrial Revolution, was it 180 or 280? I'm trying to remember.
it was around 270, 270, something
Because
like
I know
that.
they measured it like late in the 1800s is when they started,
Yeah.
and it was.
Excuse me, what's very interesting about that list is it starts off all US, and then as you get down, it gets into what is going to affect the US, although it's not in the US.
Right.
So the Great Barrier Reef, actually 414 ppm is, you've said it already.
So what strikes me about this list is that our victories are largely temporary and defensive,
Yes,
right?
yes.
So we've got climate chaos coming down the pipeline. We can cross off the Yellow River, we can cross off Yellowstone wolves, we can cross off the ozone layer. Acid rain is still a massive problem. I guess we can sort of
As long as you don't coal-fired.
They're building tons of other pipelines, so we can probably cross off the benefits of the Northern Gateway. All those rivers, all those forests in BC, they're going to be killed. Cherry Point, the eelgrass beds there, the forage fish that feed the salmon, that feed the orcas, they're all going down. Air quality, you can't. I heard the other day that 600 parts per million feels like is when you're in an office room or a classroom on a hot, stuffy day and all the windows are closed. You feel like you can't think. That's what 600 parts per million of CO2 feels like. So that's the air quality that we're headed towards right now, which actually degrades cognitive function for everyone.
Why did you cross off ozone?
Why did I cross off?
Saying the benefits of those
Ozone.
victories are lost.
No, it's
Yeah.
an ozone layer.
So the benefits of healing the ozone layer are going to be pointless
A moot point.
Yeah.
because everything is headed the wrong direction. So similarly with all of these different issues. So many of our struggles are temporary and defensive. And so many of our defeats are permanent or nearly permanent and progressive. They stack on top of each other, right? Once you've cut down an old growth forest, you can't just get it back. It's gone for a long time,
Tar sands.
right? And we're still feeling the impact of greenhouse gases that were released decades ago. And it's our children and future generations who are going to have to deal with the effects of greenhouse gases that are being released right now. So what we get a picture here, we get a picture of a movement that is essentially staging a running retreat. We're losing.
Yes.
And I think we need to be honest about that because it's bullshit. It's really bullshit. I get these emails, I read these emails from environmental organizations. I was reading this article the other day, this thing that came out of Mississippi Stand, which was this amazing fight, this amazing struggle to try and stop the Dakota Access Pipeline. And people put their bodies on the line repeatedly and innovated nonviolent direct action tactics. And they did some amazing stuff. That's also the camp that Jessica Resnicek helped found, one of the two women who sabotaged the Dakota Access Pipeline repeatedly. And this document was reflecting on their strategies from what they learned from their months-long struggle. And it painted a picture of a movement that was like on the verge of winning. And I'm just thinking, what is this delusion that people have? How can people think that we're actually winning? I mean, yeah, we're having some victories. But I mean, okay, we brought back wolves to Yellowstone. Meanwhile, we're destroying a livable climate for every species on this planet. And carbon emissions are getting higher and higher every single year. We have not only been able to not reverse climate change, we have been unable to even slow the acceleration of climate change. We've been unable to even halt that acceleration. So when people talk about, we're winning, we're on the verge of winning, all this amazing stuff is happening, I'm thinking, what kind of world are you living in? And critically, what strategy is that going to lead you towards? How is that going to influence what you actually do on a day-to-day basis? If you feel like we're winning, then that's really going to change how you approach things, right? Whereas if you acknowledge the reality that we're losing badly, I mean, we're getting our asses kicked. The planet is getting murdered. And if you acknowledge that, I mean, for one, it hurts. We talked, this grief workshop we keep going back to. It hurts, right? Okay? I think that's important to acknowledge. It hurts a lot. And for me, one of the things that I always return to is that, for one, my emotional state isn't as important as the real world, which isn't to say that it's not important for me as an individual. I need to deal with it. I need to do what's necessary to take care of myself and feel good. And, I know for me, I love life. I love this planet. I love getting out in nature. I love connecting with my family, my friends, a lot of great people to see here. Like, I enjoy life. And I don't think that it is, a lot of people, I think, have this dichotomy that if you acknowledge, this idea that if you acknowledge how bad things are, you can't also enjoy your life. That, like, you're just walking around in a terrible state of depression all the time, which isn't true for myself. I don't know about other people. But a lot of people in my community, we acknowledge this reality, and we can also be happy. I think it's possible for us to hold these very conflicting emotions at the same time. Life is beautiful, and also we are totally fucked right now.
Yes.
And it's not surprising to me that we are totally fucked. Because defense alone cannot win a war. Defense alone cannot win a war. If you're in any kind of struggle and you only play defense, it's inevitable that you'll lose. No matter how good you are at playing defense, you will lose. Because it doesn't matter if you win 99% of the time, as long as you lose at least one time, every so often, the trend is going to be down. You're heading towards a defeat every time. And the thing is, we're not winning 99% of the time. I mean, look at this list. If we're lucky, we're winning 10% of the time. If we're lucky, right?
And you turn your backs and they turn around and get you.
Yeah, exactly. People let their guard down. People get worn out by fighting these projects for a decade, 2 decades, 3 decades. I mean, people pour their lives into these fights, which is amazing. It's incredible. We need that. And it destroys us. And meanwhile, somebody on the other side is making 6 figures to do the same thing. Well, we're doing it for nothing in our spare time. We're sacrificing our families and our kids and our real life to fight, right? So I think we're in a war. And I think if anyone doubts that, they should talk to the Klallam warriors. They should talk to the people in modern economic colonies that are being exploited to feed this consumer culture. They should tell that to the people on the front lines at Standing Rock, who are having cutting-edge military technologies essentially deployed against them and brutal violence. They should tell that to the people on the front lines in Ferguson. They should tell that to the forests being clear-cut right up here. They should tell that to the orcas who are starving to death right now. They should tell that to the last meadows in the Salish Sea lowlands who are being paved over. They should tell that to the millions of refugees, to the people who are, fleeing small island states that are disappearing under the ocean right now. I think we need to recognize that this is a war. And not only is it a war, it's what's called a total war. Under the normal laws of warfare, which aren't often followed, but under the normal laws of warfare, you're only supposed to fight, armed forces, formal militaries, battle, and then, it decides the victor. In total war, anything is a target. Everybody's a target. The civilian population, hospitals, schools, everything. And that's the situation we're in right now. Everything is fair game for the ruling class. And I want to acknowledge, too, that this isn't really a rational problem that we're in. At a certain point, for the ruling class, it's rational for them to exploit and get more benefit for themselves, in a twisted way. You can see their reasoning, right? But at a certain point, these problems cease to be rational because they're destroying the basis for all life on this planet. And they're not stopping. They're not stopping. I think a big part of that is because they don't have the power to stop it. The systems are really in charge.
Yeah.
So often the individuals who are embedded in these systems don't really have that many choices. One of the quotes that I think about is from the rapper Tupac, which is funny because sort of a crossover from a whole different part of my life. But Tupac said, don't blame me, I was given this world, I didn't make it. And I think about that when people say things like, you know, it's all of our fault. We need, you know, this problem came from us. I just think bullshit. You know, this problem didn't come from us. I didn't make any of these decisions to do these things. I was born into this world, just like Tupac was born into, you know, the gang life in LA and had to exist in that world and learn how to survive in that world. I was born into this world. I was born into car culture. I was born into a world where to get around and survive, you pretty much have to have a car. You know, I didn't make that choice. None of us really made that choice. So the systems are so often in charge.
You know that quote by Marx, men make their own history, but only under conditions given.
Right, yeah. Same idea. So the question for me that leads me to this workshop, really the reason I'm here, is what does an offensive movement look like? If we accept that so many of our struggles are defensive, what does offense look like? Recognizing that you can't win with defense alone. What does offense look like? And I don't think we ask that question. We never think about it. Because this is the model that we have. All of these things, this is what we're taught. This is what activism is, this is what fighting back looks like, this is what resistance is. I mean, even the most cutting edge militant wings of the movement, you know, are going to places like Standing Rock and are fighting the expansion of one small part of the fossil fuel infrastructure. The battleground is chosen by those in power. We didn't choose that fight. They forced that fight on us. And when they choose the conditions under which we're even having the conflict, it's almost inevitable that they're going to win. So we need to create a fight on our own terms. We don't think about this. What does that actually look like? What does an offensive struggle look like? So I want to do another exercise here. And maybe you all can split off here actually into a few small groups with the people around you, whatever size you want. And I just want you to take 5 or 10 minutes and just talk about what does offensive struggle look like. Just talk that out. I don't expect you to solve it, but I just want you to try and explore that idea. What are offensive strategies look like? How do we choose our own battleground? Is that clear to everyone? Okay. So let's do a few minutes, and I'll go around and check in with the groups, and then we can throw out some of the ideas. Okay, deep breath. Those discussions sounded pretty intense. But I think it's great, you know. We don't have these discussions. This isn't really a permissible topic. I think we're still operating, you know, the group CELDF talks about the box of allowable activism. I think we are very much all operating within that box of allowable activism. We're operating within a framework that has been set up for us. And it's been set up because it doesn't work.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's why that is the framework that we have inherited. Because it doesn't work. That's why we are all beating our heads against the wall, trying to stop the latest pipeline, the latest clear cut, all of these projects, and failing. Or even if we win, they turn around and do another one. Or they come back the next year, 10 years later, and they get it through. So I heard some of the talk that was going on in these groups, and I was kind of trying to listen to what was going on, and a lot of it fell into these categories. So I want to talk about each of them for just a second here. So green technology is the first one. A lot of people think of green technology as one method of offensive struggle. And I think that is a big mistake. I actually wrote a book that is probably coming out next year about green technology and why the environmental movement should oppose green technology. Solar panels, wind turbines, electric cars, all of these things, I think we should oppose them. Because I think that they represent new energy sources and new ways to power civilization, which is the thing that's destroying the planet. Right. The problem is not that our cars run on gas, the problem is that cars exist. right?
Yeah.
The problem is not that our electricity comes from coal-fired power plants. The problem is that we have a massive, high-energy, high-consumption civilization.
We're so addicted.
If we're going to power that with solar panels, does that really look any different than what we're seeing already?
No.
Is it any surprise that companies like Intel and Coca-Cola and Apple and Microsoft and Walmart are investing heavily in wind power and solar power? The oil is running out. The easy-to-access oil is gone. They're turning to the next best energy source, which is so-called renewable energy. They're not doing it because they give a shit about the planet. They don't give a damn about the planet. They say that they do. That's propaganda. That's propaganda 101. You don't talk about the real reasons why you're doing something. The US military is investing heavily in these green technologies. They're saying that it allows them to support bases and outposts in remote areas, and they don't have to do fuel convoys. So it allows them to increase their fighting power. They're not doing it because they give a damn about the planet. The US military is the biggest polluter in the world. They're doing it because it gives them more power. I think we need to completely shift our framework. We need to stop looking at the economy, the global industrial economy, as our economy, and start looking at it as an occupation economy. We need to look at it as an occupying force that's destroying the planet. And then we need to react to that situation, right? As long as we are inside that box of allowable activism, everything is controlled by the capitalists. And green technology falls squarely into their realm. And that's why you have some of the wealthiest people in the world talking about the $100 trillion of wealth that can be unlocked by the green power revolution. They see business opportunity. They see money. They see profit. They're not thinking about, saving the planet. These people don't, understand what a right relationship with the earth looks like. One of the biggest factories in the world is being built right now. It might even be finished, I don't know, right outside Reno in Nevada. And it's to build electric car batteries, the Tesla Gigafactory. A massive factory. It's something like dozens of acres. And environmentalists are actually saying this is a good thing. A gigantic factory that takes metals that were blown out of mountains and makes them into a consumer product to sell for profit. And most environmental groups are supporting this. I'm thinking to myself, what the fuck happened? What kind of world are we living in? I mean, the environmental movement, the mainstream environmental movement, has completely lost touch with reality when it comes to green technology. The propaganda around green technology has been relentless for the past decade. And I know because I fell prey to it. It wasn't like I always understood this. I mean, when I was 16, I was reading treehugger.com every day. I was really concerned about climate change. I became a vegetarian. I was riding my bike everywhere. And I was saying, everybody needs to do this. Everybody needs to get solar panels. And if you're going to have a car, it should be a hybrid or electric car. I was all gung-ho about that. And what I didn't realize was that, the reason Tree Hugger is so big, the reason these movements that promote green technology are so big, is because foundations give them money to promote these things. And foundations is just a way to say rich people. The wealthy, the ruling class, give them money to promote technologies that make them a huge amount of profit and don't change the fundamental nature of the system at all. They want to create, at best, a slightly more sustainable empire. They want to create a low-carbon empire. They want low-carbon capitalism, right? So I don't think we can look at any of that as a solution. I get all heated about that topic, in case you didn't realize. Yeah?
Sorry, the slashes in each one, just quick.
Yeah, so we were talking about basically how so many of these victories are temporary, in that the benefits that come from them are being wiped out by the long-term changes that we're seeing in the long-term trend.
Just wanted to take 5 seconds.
Yeah. Second category that a lot of offensive strategies people think about falls under is government. Another one to be very wary of. it makes sense to go this route, right? Governments are how power is wielded in the world today. It makes sense, right? You go to the government to create change. I don't think it's going to work. And the reason I don't think it's going to work is because all of the evidence says it's not going to work. Literally all of the evidence. There is no evidence that the government is going to figure this out, right? The Kyoto Protocol, afterwards emissions went up. Copenhagen Accord, after that emissions went up. Paris Agreement, emissions are still rising. They're the highest they've ever been. They can't figure it out. They don't know what to do.
There's a great quote from journalist Martha Gellhorn where she says, all governments are bad and some are worse.
Yeah. I think a lot of us are laboring under this illusion that what we learned in civics class is actually true. Again, to go back to that green technology thing, propaganda, we need to understand propaganda, right? James Madison, one of the framers of the Constitution, once said that, what's the exact quote? The primary function of government is to protect the minority of the opulent against the majority. The primary function of government is to protect the minority of the opulent against the minority. That's one of the people who wrote the foundational legal document that we all live under right now. This system does not exist to serve us, okay? It exists, yeah.
They get paid to not know what to do.
Right, and I mean, we've all seen this in so many ways. I mean, there was a couple academics who did a study recently where they actually looked at how much influence wealthy people have on the US political system. And what they found was essentially average people in this country have more or less zero influence on policy in this country. And wealthy people have more or less an extremely high amount of influence on policy in this country. And their conclusion was, based on the data, we live in an oligarchy.
Yeah.
Which you do.
Right? Yeah. I mean, we all know this. So it's very confusing to me how at the same time we all know this, and then we still say, let's go to the government route to fix things. You know? And again, I think it's because we're operating in this box of allowable activism. And we can't let ourselves think outside that box because it starts to get pretty scary. And it starts to get serious. I mean, the thing about the box of allowable activism, maybe the only benefit of it, is that it's relatively safe. It's safe to stay in that box. There's not really that much up for grabs.
It's not safe if the whole box gets dumped in the ocean.
Or is on fire. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
So-
I'm waiting to hear your theory of taking over the political space, though.
Offensive struggle. So, the entire governmental paradigm, I don't think is going to help. I don't think that means that nobody should ever run for office. I'm not one of those people who's going to say never vote. That's terrible. You know, a lot of people who say don't vote ever, they're sort of reifying voting. They're still looking at voting as like this sacred contract between the people and the government, where like you give your authority to the representatives, and so therefore if you vote, you're participating in the system and giving up your purity, and you can never say anything bad about your representatives after that. It's stupid. Like, I vote pragmatically, I vote pragmatically. I'm a lesser evil voter. Even though I know that, it's not going to change the big system. It takes me 5 minutes, whatever. But I know that this is going to have very, very little impact on anything.
Can democracy be a non-governmental structure?
Absolutely, yeah. And that kind of relates to the next point here, which is movements. One example of that, I think, would be something like what's happening in northern Syria right now, where people are forming essentially autonomous communities based on direct democracy. They don't have political representatives, they have delegates who can only say what the people tell them to say, and they're recallable at any time for any reason. So you don't have the problem of, you elect a politician and they break every campaign promise, for example. And that's the group that you may have heard. They've formed the all-women's brigade fighting ISIS. Yeah, exactly. So mass movements. In the past decade, we've seen a lot of movements. We've seen Occupy. We've seen the movement for Black Lives. We've seen all kinds of things. We've seen the growth of the climate movement. And I want to argue that while these movements are essential, they're probably not going to lead to the change that we need. The problem with movements, in my opinion, is that they can be undermined or co-opted very easily. We've seen that with many of these movements, and one element of that is how foundation funding shapes movement goals. I'm not necessarily arguing that there are people, with some great secret plan. I think this is just organically how it evolves. When you can get funding to have policies in a certain direction, you're probably more likely to lean in that direction. And groups that have a large amount of funding are more likely to rise to the top and rise to leadership within broader movements. They're more likely to have the resources to simply get their people where they need to be, get them on stage, get them a megaphone so that they can be heard. Foundation money comes from the rich, and the rich are not interested in fundamental or revolutionary change, right?
Maybe you want me to ask this later, but there are some smart people who also happen to be rich.
Right. These are generalizations. I'm absolutely making generalizations.
Yeah. But, okay.
Anyway,
I think that may be. The smart people who understand that they're killing their kids.
Right.
May be allies.
I think that can be possible. I know of at least one very wealthy person who was just born into money and actually wants to dismantle capitalism and has a real revolutionary goal. Yeah. But it's the exception. So one of the most interesting news stories around movements actually came out in 2013 when there was a big leak of documents from the company Stratfor. Do any of you remember that? Stratfor is a private intelligence corporation. So they're sort of like Blackwater or Tiger Swan, but those are more private military corporations. Stratfor is more about intelligence gathering and strategy and clandestine work, infiltration, that sort of thing. And Stratfor has worked for the American Petroleum Institute, Dow Chemical, Coca-Cola, Northrop Grumman, basically a who's who of atrocity makers. And the leaked documents actually revealed part of their strategy for fighting social movements. And I think this is so important that we understand. They talk about dividing activists into 4 groups: radicals, idealists, realists, and opportunists. And then they say the opportunists are in it for themselves. They want fame, they want prominence, they want money, they want attention, whatever it is. They can be diverted based on their own self-interest very easily. They basically say, we don't have to worry about the opportunists. We all know about this. We have to watch out for these people in our movements, right? Realists can be convinced that transformative change is not possible, and we have to settle for what is possible. So these are the people who are saying, that's not feasible, that's not real, we might want that, but we got to deal with the real world. So instead, we're going to vote with the Democratic Party and form an alliance with them, or something along those lines, right? Idealists can be convinced that they basically have their facts wrong. These are the type of people who will say things like, we can't shut down the tar sands because so many people have jobs in that community, and we need to be compassionate for them and their families. These are the idealists, and they can be very easily manipulated because of that emotion. This is what Stratfor is saying. And finally, you have radicals who see the system as corrupt and needing transformation. These are direct quotes from their document. They say radicals should be isolated and discredited using false charges to assassinate their character, for example. This is just one way that movements are undermined. Mass movements are very easy for private security companies like this, or the FBI. We can look back at COINTELPRO. They're very easy for them to infiltrate and break apart in various ways.
Or assassination.
Right, or outright assassination. We need to understand, though, that these popular mass movements are often shaped by the ruling class in one way or another. Through funding, through infiltration, through all these different means. They're shaped and they're controlled and they're directed in certain ways.
Is there somewhere on the internet where that's available, the leaks from that document?
Yes, I could give it to you afterwards, or if you Google Stratfor leaks,
Stratfor.
probably
And how do you
find.
spell it? Is it just?
STRATFOR. So it's like strategic forecasting,
Oh, got it. Okay.
something like that. So here's another quote from their leak that I think is so important. This is really important. Most authorities will tolerate a certain amount of activism because it is seen as a way to let off steam. They appease the protesters by letting them think they are making a difference as long as the protesters do not pose a threat. But as protest movements grow, authorities will act more aggressively to neutralize the organizers. That's basically the history of movements in this country for the last 50, 60 years, right there, right? And that's what we've seen. So it turns out, for example, another example of this sort of co-optation, there's a popular theorist of nonviolence, Srđan Popović, who led the Optor movement in Serbia that overthrew Slobodan Milosevic nonviolently. It turns out his wife worked for Stratfor, and he was working closely with the US government to, for example, try and overthrow Hugo Chavez. So this is how movements can be co-opted from being forces for justice to trying to overthrow, one of the few socialist governments in the world that's actually trying to do good by poor people and change the system. I'm not saying that Hugo Chavez was perfect, but this is what we see. These movements can be so easily co-opted and pulled in different directions. So next category is uprisings. This could be something like insurrection. A lot of people sort of like to reify or really look up to spontaneous uprising. People really like this idea of spontaneity and the people leading the way and the people sort of spontaneously developing consciousness and revolutionary ideals and stepping forward and creating a movement. I have no problem with this, but I don't think it happens very often, and I think it leaves too much to chance. I think if we're going to save the planet, we need to have a plan, even if it's only a broad plan or a framework that we're operating within.
Ask examples like sunrise or
the Yellow Vest. Yeah, the Yellow Vest movement in France. I don't know that much about sunrise, so I'm not sure. I think I would put that more in the realm of movements and foundation influenced demands. Another reason to be wary is that without an explicitly revolutionary framework, people tend to devolve to the lowest common denominator. Whatever's the dominant ideology within a society tends to rise to the top and start to define things. And within our society, the dominant ideology is capitalism. So that's what happens so often, is because there is not a well-articulated and there's not a basis of a revolutionary strategy and ideology, capitalism rises to the top. And it starts to define increasingly the movement. And I think green tech is a great example of that. I think a lot of the people who are running green tech companies now were real grassroots environmentalists 30, 40, 50 years ago. And we're really focused on protecting old growth forest and protecting prairies and having real relationship with real land. But because they did not have a revolutionary ideology, capitalism sort of bubbled its way up to the top and came to define increasingly how they were working, how they were engaging. And the final category is revolution. And that's what I am really here to talk about. My dictionary defines revolution as forcible overthrow of a government or social order in favor of a new system. And a revolution is generally a planned, premeditated process. That was really loud. Now I'm yelling at everyone. It's generally a planned, premeditated process that is led by a group of trained revolutionaries, right? This is exactly what groups like the Black Panthers were trying to do, right? And I want to argue that the offensive strategy we need today looks something like a revolution. And I call this workshop Revolutionary Ecology because, unlike past movements that have mostly focused on human systems, human politics, human justice, I think we need a movement that is broader than that. We need a revolutionary movement that takes ecology as its basis, right? The Irish revolutionary James Connolly, in 1909, he said, "Revolution is never practical until the hour of the revolution strikes. Then it alone is practical, and all the efforts of the conservatives and compromisers become the most futile and visionary of human imaginings." There was another quote from a guy, I think his name was Michael McFaul, who was on the National Security Council, and he said, "Beforehand, every revolution seems impossible, and in retrospect, every revolution seems inevitable." I'm hoping that that's the situation that we're in right now, because it sure feels impossible. But I think that as increasingly the environmental movement is grappling with this reality, a lot of us are getting to the breaking point. You know, a lot of us are getting increasingly frustrated, increasingly angry. We're recognizing that a lot of these things aren't working, and we're out of options. And that's what I think a revolutionary ecology movement could offer, is a legitimate alternative, a legitimate path forward to take the offense, to stop playing this running defensive game, you know, to stop playing whack-a-mole with their pipeline projects and their coal terminals and all their different bullshit, you know, to take the fight on our own terms and take it to them. I think most of the strategies, the revolutionary strategies that we commonly think of, things like Marxism and anarchism, were designed to solve other problems. They weren't designed to solve the problems that we're facing right now. They're kind of irrelevant to the problems we're facing right now. They have a lot of insights. They have a ton of insights, but they're not designed for this situation that we find ourselves in. That's why I think we need to build a new movement of revolutionary ecology. I think we need to create this, essentially. The framework is already there. A lot of the work has already been done, but it's been on the fringes of the environmental movement. I think we need to make it increasingly central. We do have a few examples of what a revolutionary ecology movement could look like. To date, the only thing that actually reduced the rise in emissions was the 2008 financial crash.
And 9/11, I think, did for a little while.
So logging in the Amazon rainforest, when the 2008 financial crash came along, boom, plummeted. Emissions plummeted. That's because the global industrial economy is built on the destruction of the planet. That is literally what it is made of.
Yes.
You look at a place like the Port of Seattle, and what you're seeing is the carcasses of mountains and the carcasses of fish swarms and the carcasses of forests and the carcasses of prairies being dragged in on giant ships and fed to the empire, essentially. The global economy exists and grows by destroying the planet. And that's, again, I think we need to switch from looking at this economy as something that we belong to or belongs to us, and instead look at it as an occupying force.
So Max, you said something about trained revolutionaries, like a small group. Do you think that this movement does need leaders?
Absolutely, yeah. I think
sometimes it seems that people do, like a lot of people just don't know quite how to, coalesce. And then when someone comes and speaks their language and engages their heart, then people can really gather and put force behind them.
Yeah. I think that the left tends to have a rejection of authority and a rejection of leadership for very good reason, because of the patriarchal figures and because of abuse and exploitation and a lot of horrible things that leaders tend to do within this culture, even within people's movements. So often you have men taking advantage of women, because of their position or what have you, and so we're wary of leadership. And I think that it's very possible to have leaders and uphold and support leaders without reifying them or making them into, you know, a god or something like that. Having accountability, having transparency in real relationship. But I do think that is incredibly important. So just to jump back, you know, we're talking about the economy here. One of the fundamentals of strategy in a conflict, in a war, is that you win by depriving your enemy of the ability to wage war. And a military strategist, I believe his name was Liddell Hart, he said the point of war should be to paralyze, not to destroy. And you could see that, for example, when the US went into Iraq. Their first targets were things like power plants, bridges. They tried to paralyze the country because that's how you win a war. You don't necessarily kill every single soldier. You deprive them of the ability to fight. And that's how you win most effectively, right?
And conversely, in 2004, when the U.S. opened up the two-front war against both the Shia and the Sunni in Fallujah and Sadr City, there was a time, and none of this was reported, but most of their supply lines to the green zone and to their bases were completely cut off by the resistance. And if the U.S. didn't have air power, they wouldn't have won.
Yeah.
Full stop.
Yeah. So we need to deprive our enemy of the ability to wage war. And I think that means shutting down the global industrial economy by any means necessary. Because like I said, 414.52 and rising. I mean, we are headed into an apocalypse. We are headed into a situation of hundreds of millions of climate refugees. You know, the Syrian civil war has unleashed 1 million refugees, and that's destabilized Europe. It's led to these, you know, massive political ramifications all around the world. We're talking something an order of magnitude, 2 orders of magnitude bigger, all over the world, right? And that's just one of many impacts that we're looking at. So when I talk about any means necessary, I really mean any means necessary. When we actually confront the reality of the situation we're facing, all this stuff starts to look pretty insufficient. It starts to look like fiddling around the edges while the empire burns, you know, while the world burns. What gives me hope is that as the global economy has become increasingly globalized, it has become increasingly centralized, right? So an ancient empire like the Roman Empire was inherently somewhat decentralized. They got their food from all sorts of different areas. And because they didn't rely on industrial technology like we do today, they were relatively buffered against shock. But anybody who's been through a natural disaster today knows how short the supply lines of modern civilization are. I mean, one hurricane comes through and every grocery store is empty, right? But we're not talking about targeting grocery stores and targeting everyday people. That's not the goal of a revolutionary ecology strategy. The goal is to shut down the global industrial economy. The whole system is interdependent. So a fracking operation in Colorado is dependent on drilling equipment that might be made in South Korea, and is dependent on ball bearings that might be made in Ohio, and frac sand from Wisconsin, right? And diesel that was maybe extracted from the tar sands and refined. You can't run oil refineries without cheap, abundant energy, electricity, and so on. These are concrete institutions, concrete systems that can be stopped, that can be targeted. To move beyond defensive struggles, I think we need to start thinking in terms of systems, flows, and bottlenecks in these systems. We need to understand how fossil fuels are extracted, how they're transported, how they're distributed, and we need to learn where we can intervene to have the maximum impact. And what I'm really talking about is a domino effect. Because with the increasing centralization of the global industrial economy, it has become increasingly vulnerable to disruption. A term that I want you all to remember is cascading systems failure. Cascading systems failure. And those with a medical background may be familiar with this term, right?
Yep.
This is what we want to achieve within the global industrial economy. We want to achieve cascading systems failure. Now, this could be done, theoretically, completely non-violently without harming anyone directly. Theoretically. But I don't want anyone to have any illusions, because what I'm talking about here is essentially an armed uprising, an armed revolution against global capitalism, against the status quo. It's the most direct form of direct action possible. You know, I think about these things, and they seem very indirect to me. 414.52 parts per million. Fossil fuels are the main source of carbon emissions, right? And we're talking about changing the government and passing legislation. We're talking about creating new technologies. We're even talking about doing small symbolic blockades or stopping the newest pipeline from going in. But for some reason, we're not talking about destroying the fossil fuel system. And there are understandable reasons for this. You know, this is not a strategy that I consider lightly, and hopefully I've conveyed that in this presentation. You know, I have been contacted by the FBI multiple times because of what I say. I'm okay with that. You know, that's one benefit of coming from a family where I'm a third-generation political dissident. Because when my aunt heard that the FBI called me, she said, "Good for you, you must be doing something right." But we need to recognize that there are real consequences. But me getting a phone call from the FBI is nothing compared to this, or this, or this, or this. Nothing. Nothing. Whatever could happen to me is nothing compared to the loss of 98% of the old-growth forest across this continent.
Yeah.
It's just insignificant in comparison. This is not about me. It's not about any of us as individuals. This is about life on this planet. So, most people think about Nelson Mandela as a paragon of nonviolence, which is pretty interesting considering that he helped found the Umkhonto we Sizwe, or the Spear of the Nation, which was the armed wing of the ANC in South Africa, which conducted sabotage, guerrilla warfare, and assassinations against the apartheid government. And when he was on trial for his crimes, he was labeled a terrorist by the US and the South African government, among others. He went on to the witness stand, and he said the following: "I do not deny that I planned sabotage. I did not plan it in a spirit of recklessness, nor because I have any love of violence. I planned it as a result of a calm and sober assessment of the political situation that had arisen after many years of tyranny, exploitation, and oppression of my people by the whites. I'm dependent on the global industrial economy for my life. Most of my food comes from that system. My survival comes from that system. Some of my food comes from elsewhere. I do foraging. I grow my own food. I even hunt. I try to be independent from the capitalist system. Not for reasons of personal purity, because personally I'm not that concerned about personal purity when it comes to things like that, but because I simply think that's a better way to live. And I like to do that. I enjoy it. It gives me more freedom to pursue what I love to do, which is this type of work. Most of us are dependent on the global industrial economy for survival because we are living in the heart of empire. All of the resources are flowing towards us here. I was playing with my 2-year-old nephew yesterday morning. He's dependent on the system for survival. He lives in the middle of Seattle. If the global industrial economy collapses, it is likely that he would die. It is likely that I would die. This is real. This is real shit.
Yes.
And I'm not saying these things out of recklessness or because I have any love of violence. I'm saying it because I do not see any of these other things working. Everything is headed in the wrong direction. And my life is not as important as life on this planet. Period.
So are you saying like go to an oil refinery and bomb it? I mean, that can be like, what are we specifically talking about? I mean, like when you say destroy it, is that something like that? I'm not saying that you're telling us to do that, but I mean, like, we're talking about taking it like whatever it takes, and you're talking about destroying these things rather than like protesting in front of it.
Ultimately, I think that we need to destroy the oil economy physically, yes.
Okay.
And I'm not proposing that we do what the ELF has done. You know, I'm not proposing that we go out and conduct one-off operations of eco-sabotage. I think if this is actually going to happen and be effective, we need a revolutionary ecology movement. This needs to be happening globally. There need to be multiple people doing this, multiple organized groups that are networking, that are training with each other, that are practicing security culture, that are practicing operational security, that are highly serious and dedicated.
Does that exist, do you think? Is this happening in the world?
One example that I can point to is what's happening in Nigeria. Nigeria is the largest oil producer in Africa, and the largest oil producing region is the Niger River Delta, which is the largest wetland in the world. And Shell Oil has extracted billions of dollars worth of oil from this area. And over the past 50 years, an equivalent amount of oil has spilled as if they had an Exxon Valdez oil spill every year for 50 years. And the people formed a nonviolent resistance movement. It was called the Movement for the Survival of the Ogoni People. And it was led by Ken Saro-Wiwa, who some of you may know that name. He's famous. He was a poet and a nonviolent leader in that community. And Ken Saro-Wiwa and I believe 10 other leaders of that movement were captured by the military government and hung in what was widely considered to be an atrocity and a human rights crime at the time. And so after that happened, a next generation of the movement evolved, which was called MEND, the Movement for the Emancipation of the Niger Delta. And that group used speedboat tactics, explosives, and weapons to attack oil pipelines and other facilities. And in a series of attacks between roughly 2005 and 2010, they were able to knock out 40% of the oil production capacity in Nigeria, the largest oil producer in Africa. 40%. Our movements in this country have not been able to stop the growth in oil production. You know, fracking has exploded. The United States is now a leader in oil production globally. We have not done even 1% of what MEND was able to achieve. In one single attack, they knocked out 10% of oil production. 10%. So MEND has said to the oil companies in one of their communiques, they said, leave our land or die in it. And when I talk about this being an occupation economy that we're living under, that's what I'm talking about. That's the type of approach that we need to have towards these systems. Leave our land or die in it. And this is just one example. And largely, I don't think that this strategy has existed. I don't think it has been tried. And honestly, in a lot of ways, this strategy feels like a Hail Mary to me. But it also feels like, fuck it. Nothing else is working.
Yeah.
You know? Everything's headed in the wrong direction. And just one more point on that is that, any abusive system, I've heard this about abusive relationships on a personal level, is that abusive men tend to destroy their partner's relationships with other people and try and isolate them so that they are completely dependent on the abusive man for survival, for money, for housing, for everything. And it makes it impossible for them to leave. That's the situation we're all living in. And I think a lot of us have Stockholm syndrome. I think a lot of us love the system that is abusing us and destroying us, and we have some sort of allegiance to it, a misplaced allegiance. So.
You mentioned disruption. Wondering about general strikes. What do you think about that?
I think I support the labor movement. Earlier, I talked about how absent a revolutionary ideology and guiding force, whatever the dominant ideology is within a society will tend to rise to the top. And I think trade unions in this country are a great example of that. Because absent a revolutionary edge, trade unions have essentially become a way to guarantee middle-class people have a decent standard of living. They've completely lost their anti-capitalist roots. So when I look back at, the battle for Blair Mountain and the real revolutionary roots that a lot of labor unions have, that is inspiring history to me. And that seems like it's mostly completely gone. Union membership right now is lower than it's ever been, I believe. And I just don't see it as a viable... Again, I was talking about Marxism and anarchism and how they are revolutionary strategies that were designed for different problems. They weren't designed to solve the ecological crisis. And I think, labor union struggles are a great example of that. Labor union struggles were created to address a certain category of problems. I don't think they were created to address the problems that we're facing now. So I think it's worthwhile, certainly, but I don't see it as ultimately leading towards any major change.
What proportion of the global economy is the fossil fuel industry?
That's a good question. I don't know.
The reason I'm thinking it would seem to me that the global economy may be strategically vulnerable, even more so than the fossil fuel industry. And that if one went after one could take down the fossil fuel industry in one place, it's so global, I don't see how you could take it down everywhere. And then with the financial system, it would seem to me it would rush in and repair damage.
Yeah, that's certainly a challenge. And I think that's the reason why I brought up that term cascading systems failure. And I think that's also the reason why I tried to make a contrast with the Earth Liberation Front, where you had these one-off attacks against targets that, I think were worthwhile. Like they burned down that ski resort in Vail that was encroaching on endangered lynx habitat or something like that, some sort of feline. It's worthwhile. I support them doing that. It's ski resorts are destroying mountains all over the world now so that people can go out and have a good time. But that is not a strategic target if your goal is to bring down the global industrial economy, right? Yeah. So I don't really have an answer to that question, but that's something that I think we need to answer as a movement. And that's something that I think people who are going to do this sort of action, they'll need to answer that. They'll need to figure that out.
Okay. One last question. Don't you think somebody in Washington has gained this over?
I know for a fact that one of the books that's most inspiring to me is on the library at Quantico, the library of the FBI headquarters in Quantico. So yes.
Which book is that?
Deep Green Resistance.
Yeah. I'm sorry, what is it?
It's called Deep Green Resistance.
Deep Green Resistance.
Yeah. I had a few more things to finish out with. I know I'm rambling on. I get pretty excited about these topics, but I've got like a few more things to say. We need to build these alternative communities, these alternative ways to life, like we're building here. Somebody who's been really inspiring to me, who I've learned a lot from, is a member of the Micmac Warrior Society. And he's been in battles with the RCMP, he's been shot at, he's fought the Canadian government tooth and nail for fishing rights over a whole variety of issues. And he always says, you know, we need to gain more independence from the system to enable us to fight back better. Mm-hmm. That's how I look at communities like permaculture and eco-villages and all these things. They're wonderful. They're not going to stop this alone. They're just not going to be able to. Permaculture as a movement, you know, regenerative farming, all of these things, they've existed for 40, 50, 60 years, more in many cases. And everything's gotten worse throughout that time. There's not some switch that's going to magically be flipped where those movements suddenly solve the problems. That doesn't mean it's not worthwhile. That's not what I'm trying to say at all. What I'm trying to say is those are defensive measures and holding actions that need to be paired with offensive strategies. And people who are going to be involved in this serious type of revolutionary action can't be working 40 hours a week at the same time. They need material support. They need people to house them and clothe them and give them food and support and not ask too many questions, right? I want to talk for a minute as well about who would benefit from the collapse of the global industrial economy. There are 1.4 billion people right now who don't have access to electricity. Most of those people would probably be better off right away if global capitalism collapsed, right? There are 3 billion people who live in extreme poverty worldwide. And most of those people, many of them, are held in poverty by global capitalism, by landowners, by corporations. They don't have access to land, which means they don't have access to basic survival, the ability to provide for themselves. If the global industrial economy collapses, we're talking instant land reform for those people, right? Most of the 370 million indigenous people worldwide will probably benefit right away when the global industrial economy collapses. Many rural and urban poor people right now will probably benefit when the global economy collapses. Again, if you have access to land, you probably have access to the necessities of survival. Of course, all the non-humans will benefit. Trillions of lives. The 40.3 million people who are slaves in the world today will probably benefit. 40.3. And of course, all the future generations. I mean, uncountable trillions of beings who have yet to exist, whose futures are being foreclosed right now. And I also want to recognize that the sooner this happens, the better. Because human population is an overshoot. The world is being progressively destroyed more and more every day. And that's lowering carrying capacity. That's lowering the Earth's ability to support life. Every day, around 227,000 people are added to the global population. And that means that every day the situation gets worse. So the sooner this happens, the more life will be left over afterwards. So in conclusion, I just want to talk briefly about what we can do. And one of the first things that I think we need to do is understand this idea of a firewall. So Assata Shakur was a Black Panther, and she was also a member of the Black Liberation Army. Now, most of us are probably familiar with the Black Panthers. They did things like the breakfast programs. They did political education. They went to the steps of the California Capitol with their guns and protested police brutality. They did patrols against police brutality in their communities. This was more or less in public. They were doing public work to build organization, build understanding, and build unity, right? The Black Liberation Army was different. They were doing clandestine, highly illegal stuff. They were robbing banks, or maybe to put it more accurately, they were taking back the people's money from capitalists at banks. They were breaking people out of prison. And Assata Shakur was on the FBI most wanted list and lives in Cuba right now because she actually escaped and was able to flee the country. And she still lives there today. And she wrote this fantastic book that's just called Assata, which I highly recommend. And one of her conclusions is the importance of separating above ground and underground activity. She says, that was the biggest mistake we made. We were involved in both this highly public above ground organizing work to build awareness and understanding of this revolutionary ideology, and we were also involved in this clandestine, underground, highly dangerous work. And because we were in the public eye, the FBI knew right who to go to, right? And she's Assata. Assata.
How do you spell that?
ASSATA. So we need to be clear that we need a firewall. People like me have a target on my chest, right? I know that the FBI is watching me, you know? So if anyone is interested in doing clandestine, underground, highly illegal stuff, don't come talk to me. That's a bad idea, you know? Seriously, it's a bad idea. We need to understand this, right? We need to understand this. And this is something that you see throughout history, throughout social movements. I talked about the ANC. For many years, they were above ground and legal. Then the government changed the laws. They outlawed the ANC, and the entire organization had to go underground, right? So that line can shift depending on the political situation. But we need to be very careful about this, because if you're talking about this revolutionary strategy, we need to recognize there are people actively working against this. And they're brutal and violent, and they don't have any qualms about trying to stop people. So we need frontline fighters. There's sort of a paradox here, because the way that a lot of people get to the point where they feel like a revolutionary is by engaging in all this above ground struggle. And they just beat their head against the wall, and they get so frustrated and angry, and then they come to the point that they crack and they just want to fight. They're willing to do whatever it takes. But at that point, they feel like they've exposed themselves. They feel like they're known to the security state. And that's one of the points of having a surveillance system. You know, that's why they do it, right? One story I want to say on that note is I'm friends with a couple of the valve turners who did the tar sands pipeline closing a couple years back. They had horrible security culture, absolutely awful. They were using Gmail, they were sending text messages to each other, completely unencrypted everything. And they were pretty worried that when they showed up to the valves, the police were going to be waiting for them already. They achieved total surprise. The problem with a dragnet surveillance system, like we have now, is it's actually less effective than a targeted surveillance system is, because they gather so much information they actually can't sort through it all, right? So I'm not saying that you should do what they did, because that wasn't very smart. You should have better security culture than that.
It just happened to work.
It happened to work, but you know, I say that because it's easy to get paralyzed by considering the security state and national security state and how powerful that is. And I understand that. They want to appear all-powerful, but they're not, okay? Before considering any sort of above-ground action, you should think about whether you would be interested in underground action. What else do we need to do? I think we need to build those alternative communities. We need to build ways of supporting ourselves in our resistance, our revolutionary ecology communities. We need to build this awareness and make sure these are linked to revolutionary struggles. We need to normalize revolution. We need to make this the norm in the environmental movement and across our movements. We can't have this be on the fringes anymore. It's too late for that. We can't have green technology occupying the prime position within the movement, okay? That's not going to take us anywhere good. And we need to build serious organizations and networks, revolutionary organizations and networks. And then finally, we need to train ourselves in the skills that are necessary for serious resistance. You know, for me, that has meant things like reading memoirs of revolutionaries throughout history, reading about what it took for them in terms of the psychological skills, the mental skills, also the physical, practical skills. You know, one of my friends, again, that Micmac warrior, he says that one of the things that differentiates special forces from the regular army is wilderness skills. The ability to travel off trail, to be comfortable in the woods, to travel at night through wilderness terrain, to be comfortable spending the night out in remote conditions, to be able to survive off the land to some extent. These are things that we all have within the environmental movement, right? That's the norm. We have some advantages, right? We are comfortable in this terrain. Revolutionary movements, guerrilla movements, always operate from the hills. They operate from the wilderness. They operate from the fringes of society. So we do have some advantages. So we've covered a lot here.
Can I say something that I appreciate about you? Is you also hold integrity, and you never allow abuse at any level of women or anyone else. So I appreciate that, and that's why I like listening to you.
Thanks, Suzanne. So obviously, this sort of thing is not a small side project. This is a lifelong, long-term struggle which requires commitment, study, practice. We've talked about a lot of different things here. We've talked about the defensive struggles. We've talked about false solutions. We've talked about the occupation economy. But I want to close by just trying to imagine a world in which we've won these struggles. Imagine a future in which you never hear the hum of an internal combustion engine ever again. You know, I want you to imagine a world in which you never see a car moving ever again, unless maybe a horse is pulling it. I want you to imagine a world where the orcas are re-inhabiting the Salish Sea and are flourishing, and the salmon runs are bigger every year than they were the year before. That's the world that I'm interested in fighting for. And the world we're headed towards right now is the opposite of that. So David Brower is a guy who, he's dead now, but he was the founder of the Earth Island Institute, founder of Friends of the Earth, and he was the director of the Sierra Club for many years in the early days. And one of the quotes that he said towards the end of his life was, "All I have done in my career is slow the rate at which things are getting worse." I can't speak for the rest of you, but I'm not content to do that. I'm not interested in slowing the rate. I actually want to stop things. I consider the living world to be my kin, to be my family, and I think it's time that we fight for our family. So that's all I got. I can take some questions. Yeah.
I know I was late. If anyone wants to meet up and talk about anything to catch me up, that'd be cool.
Do you have any books out at this point, or?
I have an essay collection that I wrote that addresses a lot of these topics.
And that's out published?
It's out, yeah. My website is just my name, maxwilbert.org.
Okay.
So you can find it on there if you're interested.
Thank you.
Yeah. Anybody else? Okay, thanks a lot, everyone.
Thank you, Mary.